Hello class, I thought I'd do a video again this week about the 18th century, which is a fascinating time of change and development. Between 1700 and 1800, the source of authority shifted dramatically in European society. The rise of science, as we now know it, was unique to Europe and was promulgated originally through scientific societies. Those societies had to argue for validity to the church and religious authorities in 1700. By 1800, the situation had almost exactly reversed. Now, the faith community, theologians, and teachers of religion almost had to do something like apologetics to an increasingly secular world to make their claims valid. As we will see, the modern era of theology in the West begins with Friedrich Schleiermacher, 1768 to 1834, really an epochal theologian whose method is a direct response to Kant while also being heavily influenced by German pietism. And I'll talk much more about Schleiermacher next week. The full effect and influence of the Protestant and Catholic Reformations of the 16th century evolved over the next few centuries after the Reformation. So from 1600 to 1900, there were kind of two separate church cultures that developed independently, which included development, but also defense of certain traditions of belief and practice. This is one of the great challenges of the ecumenical movement, which seeks unity among the churches, and that's been a largely 20th century phenomenon. Many differences in doctrine are symptoms of really deeper cultural divisions, attitudes, and pieties, rather than pure doctrinal disagreement. As an example, Luther venerated Mary his entire life, even as he rejected the so-called cult of saints, something that he saw as an abuse of the church. But the impulse to reject so-called prayer to saints, which is a somewhat inaccurate caricature by Protestants of the Catholic view of saints, it's a little more nuanced than that, eventually encompassed Mary as well, and Protestants, by and large, dropped any reference to Mary as the Theotokos, or the Mother of God, which is an ancient tradition in Christianity and goes all the way back to the beginning. Now, veneration of Mary is a source of tension between Catholics and Protestants, even though it wasn't for Luther. So in any case, you have this development over these several hundred years where you have hardened Protestant church bodies that have strong views and opinions that they're defending, and a Catholic view that it's defending, and that's kind of how it developed. On the other hand, by 1700, the new science had begun to take hold, and over the course of the 18th century, the dominant authority in Western society was no longer the church, but an optimistic spirit known as enlightenment. As Kant noted, it was a process for encountering the world and arriving at truth. By 1800, nature had been desacralized and disenchanted, and old religious narratives no longer carried the authority they once did. The basis for society, and that which held it together, no longer carried the authority of, the basis for society and that which held it together was rather reasoned discourse on fundamental values, based on an empirical encounter with the world of sense experience, and a curiosity of what human beings could achieve. Industrialization and the growth of urban centers was a legacy of the Enlightenment and became even more pronounced in the 19th century as science was wedded to technology and later in turn linked to economics and the drive for ever increasing efficiency and productivity. The markers of our current global economy, in fact, began in the philosophical debates of the 18th and 19th centuries. There was, of course, a downside to this curiosity and drive to conquer. It led to the African slave trade, which exploded once Europe discovered sugar farmed in the Caribbean, and it caused an assault on the earth in search of minerals and eventually energy sources to support a burgeoning human population. And so began the whole era of fossil fuel economy, which we live in today. But the dominant cultures of the 18th century were blind to many of these concerns that have fallen into our laps in our time. They saw their work as part of what they considered a positive project to move humanity forward. The drive for democratic freedoms, casting off the authority of both the church and the throne, were other key markers of the 18th century. In the words of French philosopher Denis Diderot, 1713 to 84, quote, man will never be free until the last king is strangled by the entrails of the last priest. That revolutionary spirit and drive toward radical egalitarianism was the spirit that drove 18th century revolutions. The English colonies in the United States became the United States led an unlikely revolt against the most powerful empire in the world, England, which inspired the French Revolution and eventually the rest of Europe to take up the cause of liberation and democracy. The right of the individual to reason, to think, and to act for him or herself was the cornerstone of constitutional democracy, which has spread to many corners of the earth. The 18th century, however, was also a time of religious development and of some key themes. Many in church leadership became aware of the changing attitudes in the world at large, and perhaps for this reason there was an increase in religious revivalism and passionate faith. However, there was a new religious sensibility that began to grow in this culture: deism. Deism claims that God is the creator of the universe, but has allowed the universe more or less to govern itself under the universal laws that God put in place at the beginning of time. The language of this governing is science, as we think of it today. Deists reject the claim that God still intervenes into history, and that, for example, God could be influenced by prayer. It is skeptical of religious narratives and finds its ultimate authority in the laws of nature. Many deists argued that religion was helpful for the development of morals and for the education of society, but they generally rejected the theology of revealed religion. That is, that God appears on earth through miracles that violate the laws of nature. Many of the ideas of deism are actually reflected in the Constitution and other foundational documents of our country. At the same time, traditional Christianity was alive and well in the 18th century, and the colonists were rather experimental in their interpretation and practice of the faith. Casting off the shackles of medieval Europe, they were free to explore faith in a new way and in a new context. I was still talking about traditional Christianity, but perhaps the most important factor for faith in America has been the mixing of various faith traditions and the religious, so to speak, competition for ideas. Alexis de Tocqueville, the French sociologist, noticed in his tour of the United States in the early 1800s the vitality of churches and religious life, even though the American government supported religious freedom. The first Great Awakening had occurred in the United States and Protestant Europe in the 1730s and 40s. Led in the U.S. by Jonathan Edwards, George Whitefield, and Samuel Davies, the movement was a series of open-air revival meetings with passionate, emotional preaching and an emphasis on personal salvation in Jesus Christ. The Great Awakening marked American evangelicalism ever since. It's really stamped that flavor of Christianity in this country and had an especially large impact on Baptist, Presbyterian, Methodist, Congregationalist, and some other churches. It was less influential, however, on more liturgical and traditional churches such as Anglicans, Lutherans, and to the degree there were any, Catholics. Quakers were also less affected by the movement. The life and work of John Wesley, 1703 to 91, illustrates the 18th century impulse to revivalism and personal faith. Wesley was a charismatic church leader, preacher, and theologian, and organized an entire movement today known as Methodism. The Book of Discipline is the key book for Methodists, which defines their existence as a church. In a manner similar to Luther, Wesley did not seek a break with the Church of England, but reform from within. Unfortunately, things led to an eventual break, which is something he lamented his whole life. Wesley's life and preaching really are marked by two things: a sense of the inner awakening of his spiritual life and the need for personal, subjective experience in faith. And that's a really critical piece of what it means to be a Christian. And at the same time, his concern for the poor and the vulnerable. Methodists have been known for these two qualities: passionate faith on the one hand and social justice. Other groups and churches have grown out of Wesley's life and teaching, notably the Wesleyan, Methodist, Episcopal, and African Methodist Episcopal churches, although they have their own unique histories as well. Wesley was brought to the New World in 1736 by Governor Oglethorpe of Georgia to preach in Savannah. On the ship was a group of Moravians who calmed the nerves of all passengers when the waters got rough by singing hymns. In fact, the boat almost crashed. But Wesley was moved by their faith and their commitment to Christ, and he began actually to question his own faith in light of this. He learned that the Moravians were not afraid of death as the ship nearly wrecked. He talked to the Moravian leader Gottlieb Spangenberg about this, and Spangenberg asked him whether, quote, the Spirit of God bears witness in your spirit, end quote, that he is a child of God. Wesley hesitated. Spangenberg responded, do you know Jesus Christ, and do you know that he saved you? Wesley answered yes, but he was unsatisfied with his response because he kind of hesitated. This was odd because by appearances, Wesley had lived a very holy life. His father was a minister and he was always helpful as a child. He had been part of a Bible study group while studying at Oxford, dedicated to holiness of living, weekly communion, which was always central to his piety, and, among other things, visitation of prisons. This group was mocked by other students as a holy club, or they were also called Methodists. Now, in Georgia, Wesley experienced a crisis of faith and eventually returned to England. His time in the United States did not go well, and his congregation was happy to be rid of him. Back in England, he sought out the Moravians again. And after hearing Luther's preface to the book of Romans read by a Moravian leader in a study group, he had the experience of his heart strangely warmed. He wrote that he was saved by Christ, and he had become certain of his salvation. And that line, the heart strangely warmed, is very central. It's a well-known line in relationship to Wesley. He could not become a Moravian, however, because he found them to be too quietistic, that is, indifferent or inactive on social issues. Their focus was almost purely internal. Wesley believed faith always had to be linked to action. Wesley worked closely with George Whitefield of the Great Awakening for a time. Whitefield's passionate, emotional, open-air preaching was not Wesley's style, although he certainly couldn't argue with the results. People came in droves to hear Whitefield speak, who was supposed to have been just an incredible preacher. Eventually, there was a friendly parting of the ways, mainly on doctrine. Whitefield was more of a staunch Calvinist and thus skeptical of human free will, while Wesley was more Arminian, which was a movement attached to Calvinism that had a higher view of human free will. Wesley hoped to achieve something in parallel with the Pietist movement in Lutheran Germany, an awakening and renewal of the experience of faith and confidence in salvation, preparing members for activity in the Anglican Church, particularly the reception of communion, which was always central to him. In fact, many Anglican clergy participated in his movement at first, although it grew rapidly and so also employed lay preachers, including women, which invited some controversy. Many saw Wesley's work as a criticism of failures in the Anglican Church, which leaders resented. Further, they did not appreciate Wesley breaking the rules and allowing lay people to preach. He did this grudgingly and only because his movement really needed preachers. Lastly, Methodists drew the poor and the vulnerable to their gatherings, those who felt left out of the Industrial Revolution, which was well underway in late 18th century England. This added a further element of controversy and challenge, but it was something that is really a core value for Wesley and his followers. Methodists eventually broke with the Church of England by registering as a non-Anglican church in 1787. Wesley was deeply ambivalent about this, even though he allowed it, and struggled with the decision until his death. He ordained some ministers as missionaries to the United States so that people could hear the gospel, and really mainly so they could receive communion, which again was central to his whole sense of what Christianity was about. However, Wesley wasn't officially recognized as a bishop, so this was controversial, and he struggled with it, but made the decision for the sake of this missionary work. As a result, however, the Methodist Church in the United States developed in response to westward expansion and the need to reach many people the traditional churches were not reaching. They called their annual conferences, they call their annual conference leaders bishops, while English Methodists still use the word superintendent. Lastly, a key piece in the development of church piety in the 18th century was music, as it's kind of always been in the church. There are few church musicians more influential or frankly genius than Johann Sebastian Bach. Bach is usually considered an adherent of Lutheran orthodoxy, so he's an interesting figure to study in terms of church history, especially from a Lutheran perspective. Although elements of his music also reflect the Lutheran pietist movement, and he was a student of Lutheran Orthodox theologians, but also Johann Arndt, who kind of had a foot in both worlds, as we have seen in recent lectures. In his training and in his work, Bach was imbued with themes central to Lutheranism, a strong emphasis on law and gospel, on Christ's passion and death, and on confession and forgiveness. He was critical in the development of the cantata, a musical form that he mastered. That was something like a mass or worship service set to music. He also developed four-part chorales, a form started by Luther, which was an attempt for the congregation to sing the gospel and to engage much of the laity in their own faith development. In his article, Holy Dread, from the New Yorker, which I've posted for you to read, and I'd encourage you to take a look at it, Alex Ross makes the case for the centrality of faith in Bach's music, a point some historians have contested. Ross contends that there is no arguing with the music itself. St. John's Passion, for example, expresses in the very music itself the heart of the gospel. In the section called Herr unser Herrscher, Lord our Ruler, which I've included as a link for you to listen to on YouTube, it's a marvelous piece, you can hear the themes of dissonance and the glory of suffering on the cross. That's what that is intended to express in the early part of that section, holding the listener in a kind of suspense until it resolves into the tranquil music of the gospel. So take a listen. I'd love to hear your response to that. Bach's personal life was not nearly as interesting as Mozart's or Beethoven's. He barely traveled beyond Saxony in Germany, although he was a virtuoso on the organ, especially in terms of his ability to improvise. His writing skills were impeccable, and his musical genius is really beyond question. Some musicologists have even argued that music as a whole in the West has only steadily declined since Bach. I'm not sure if I'd agree with that, even though I'm a pretty dyed-in-the-wool Lutheran and Bach fan. Bach's music fell into disuse after his death, and he was kind of forgotten. His own children, in fact, who were also composers, Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach and Johann Christian Bach, found it stodgy and old-fashioned. However, St. Matthew's Passion, and if you know O Sacred Head Now Wounded, from our hymnal and the Lutheran hymnal, that's the key chorus in St. Matthew's Passion, was rediscovered and performed by Felix Mendelssohn in 1829, causing a Bach renaissance, which has lasted to this day. It is important to keep in mind that Bach's music was written for the church, and his more than 200 cantatas were intended to lead a congregation in worship. In a real sense, then, Bach's music brought to life the theology and beliefs of the Lutheran Reformation, and in the momentary space of that living music brought together our theme in this class of objective faith in and subjective experience of the gospel of Jesus Christ. It's a remarkable moment in history, the early 18th century. Bach died in 1750. But those are some of our key themes for the 18th century as we take a look. So I commend you the reading from Miles. Encourage you to take a look at the article. It's not a super long article by Alex Ross on Bach, especially if you're interested in music, if that's a subject you're interested in pursuing more in terms of research or writing in this class or elsewhere, or just for your own edification. Next week, we will take a look at modern theology, beginning with Friedrich Schleiermacher in the 19th century. And this is a whole new era of theology and kind of a whole new direction that theology takes, linked to a lot of developments in Western history. So I look forward to reading your posts. Let me know if you have any questions. I appreciate all of the outlines of papers and projects that you're working on. I think this is going to be really fascinating to read and share. So I wish you the best, and we'll be in touch soon.